I'd like to move on to further discussion about greenhouse gases, et cetera, and that Robin White, our next speaker. Robin White is assistant professor at the Virginia Tech University, soon to be associate professor. She's doing well. She's born in Seattle, got her BS and PhD degrees at Washington State University. She postdoced with our National Animal Nutrition Program for a year plus. Was outstanding in her performance as a postdoc, focusing on the modeling emphasis of NANP. Then she became a postdoc funded by the USDA special program, and for about a year, and then was offered a position at Virginia Tech University. She wrote, along with a colleague, a very classic paper that stimulated us to invite her to this conference. The paper was published in Proceedings of the National Academy of Science with the title Nutritional and Greenhouse Gas Impacts of Removing Animals from the U.S. Environment. Robin is in research and teaching, continuing to do research related to the paper I just read, and she teaches equine nutrition, ruminant nutrition at the graduate level, and then teaches a class in special issues of animal agriculture. She's highly qualified to present the next topic, and I'd like to introduce Robin White. Let's give her a warm welcome. Robin?
Thank you so much for the introduction, Don. I'm really pleased to share with you guys some of the work that we've done trying to take one look at what might happen if we tried to eliminate animals from the U.S. agricultural system. So I'm going to start by talking actually a lot about the same trends that Dr. Godfrey addressed, so we'll have some nice overlap there. Move through a little bit about the concept of food webs and what role animal agriculture plays in the food web of U.S. Food production. Then I'll talk a little bit about our paper, give you just a quick summary of that, and then finish up with just my opinions about where I think that we should be going with these types of discussions, which may be different than what you've heard before, so it'll be nice to have some alternative viewpoints presented, I think. So to start out, we focus on sustainability, as Dr. Godfrey addressed for us, because our population is increasing. And as a result of changing socioeconomic demographics, we have an increase in the demand for animal protein products. Now, animal products are environmentally intensive to produce, and we're already experiencing shortages in the availability of land and water for agricultural production. Now, as we've already heard, animals contribute to greenhouse gas emissions as well, and there's global interest in limiting the carbon concentrations in our atmosphere. So as a result, the food production community has kind of centered on this idea of improving the sustainability of agricultural systems. We define sustainability as this balance between social, economic, and environmental objectives, so that we're producing food in a manner that's socially acceptable and economically viable, but in a way that we are not degrading the environment such that we limit our opportunity to provide sufficient food for future generations. Now, if we jump right into it, you've already seen this graph today, which is great. Animal source foods do impact the environment. This is the same figure from the Springman paper. And what you'll see is that, of course, our specific food groups vary in their environmental impact, but animal contributions, our red bars here, are fairly significant for most environmental metrics that we might be interested in, and perhaps most notably for our greenhouse gas emissions. Now, if we look at some of these drivers behind our global food production system, this is some of the data from FAO, and I've adjusted it in a manner that at least I haven't seen before to try and put things in perspective, because we hear a lot about specific industries being the major driver behind climate change or negative environmental impacts. So what we've done here is just calculate simple correlations between environmental outputs from FAO, so land use for agriculture, agricultural emissions, and agricultural water use. Calculated the correlations between those environmental metrics and either the global population or global production of different types of crops and animal products. And the interesting thing that I found here is that it's not necessarily production of any individual product, whether crop or animal, that's most strongly correlated with our changes in environmental impact over the last several years. It's really population that is most strongly correlated, with a few exceptions, right? We have vegetables here, we have cereal grains here that are more strongly correlated with the environmental impact metrics. But really, what this graph just kind of highlights to me is something that I think Dr. Godfrey was also saying, and it's that what we're dealing with here is the incredible gravity, quite literally that force, that our growing global population is enacting on our agricultural system. Now, as he kind of alluded to, we've discussed in previous iterations of these types of human food consumption concerns, drastic things like population control. And I think that that's probably beyond the scope of this talk today, but certainly it's probably outside the realm of realistic solutions. That's my opinion. And so we sort of need to take the fact that we're dealing with a force that we simply need to adapt to. And that force is what's causing many of these challenges within our agricultural system. So if we take the fact that population growth is going to continue to occur up into some hopeful plateau in the next 50 to 100 years, it's interesting to look at the trends in efficiency. So this is also some FAO data. And instead of graphing it just as net values, which is what's most commonly done, what I've done is look at it on a per capita basis. Because if you take out the growing population, how are we doing? That's kind of the basis of my question here. So we have more crop or plant-based products produced per person. We have a marginal increase in our animal-based products, again, standardized for the global population. And at the same time, we're using less land. This is very similar to the numbers that Dr. Godfrey presented. I'd also highlight then that on a per capita basis, our agricultural greenhouse gas emissions are following the same trend. They're actually decreasing per person. Unfortunately, the population is still increasing, which is why we see the increase on a net scale. And then same thing, our agricultural water use per capita has also decreased over the last 25 to 30 years. So efficiency isn't always the perfect way to look at these things. Unfortunately, in the real world, we do deal with net values. But efficiency can give us some good standardization of how we're doing, again, in the face of this gravity associated with our growing population. And these trends, these trends are really positive, right? So part of our question moving forward needs to be how can we continue those, and then what types of changes do we need to see to try and meet our global goals. Now, unfortunately, despite having these positive trends, again, this is a different presentation of these same planetary boundaries that Dr. Godfrey presented. Rockstrom and colleagues highlighted the fact that we're already sort of outside a safe operating space for humanity in three predominant areas, right? So our climate change, rate of biodiversity loss, and our contributions to nitrogen cycling. So despite continuing to improve the efficiency of agricultural production, we still have these environmental challenges that we need to be working towards. And I would highlight that certainly in the US, because I'm supposed to be talking about the US, we're starting to see policy responses to these types of data sets and this very publicized information about the potential impacts of animal agriculture in particular. So this is our previous dietary guidelines for Americans, which runs up through next year. And you'll note that this committee made the statement that moving toward more plant-based products is going to be beneficial for human health and for the environment. So we're starting to see policy responses, and certainly a subset of our society is paying attention to those responses. What we see perhaps more commonly is media responses highlighting these same types of messaging, that reducing animal product consumption can be beneficial both from a human health perspective and from an environmental perspective. What I'm highlighting here are some headlines that came out associated with the release of the Eat Lancet report, which I'll discuss in a little bit as we go through this talk. So that's what I wanted to highlight, is kind of setting the stage of why we're asking these questions about reducing or eliminating production of animal agriculture. Now, if we change gears a little bit and talk about food webs, although we don't think about it often, as a human organism, we are actually in the business of harvesting sunlight. So we consume some primary consumers, plants, algae products. We consume some secondary consumers, namely livestock products, which would make us really kind of a tertiary consumer in this type of food chain. Now, if you all remember from second grade biology or something like that, we actually have resource loss at each stage along a food web or a food chain. And so you can see that it's very easy to ask this question, why don't we reduce resource loss? Why don't we improve the efficiency of our system by simply eliminating the middleman, i.e. eliminating our secondary consumer, right? Now, our agricultural system, I would argue, is slightly more complicated than a simple chain like that, and the complication is the important part to consider when we think about making changes to a food web. So animal agriculture and humans exist in a food web along with plant-based agriculture. And this is a fairly simplistic representation of this, but it does capture some important kind of collateral relationships. So our crop-based agricultural system takes investments in terms of fertilizer from our human and agricultural systems and returns food, fiber, biofuel, and other materials back to our human food production system. Similarly, it returns a small amount of human edible feed that livestock can consume. Livestock take that investment of human edible feed along with human inedible byproducts from food processing and inedible foods like forages and convert those into additional food, fiber, biofuel, and other materials for human society. So again, when we all learned way back in the day about food webs, at least certainly the most important thing I remember learning as a young person is the potential implications of eliminating or reducing a species in that food web, right? So if we move from a system where we have a vibrant and fairly integrated animal agriculture system to one where those animals are no longer part of the system, there's going to be collateral impacts for the rest of the system. And so we wanted to ask this question, what happens when we change one part of the food production system? And just for comparison, I want to highlight that there's a lot of kind of implicit comparisons or ways to address this question of what would happen if we eliminate or remove one part of the food production system. And the most simplistic of those is comparing foods on a substitution basis. So when we compare foods based on their carbon footprint, we implicitly are comparing a kilo of one product to a kilo of another product, right? I.e., if we substituted crop products in lieu of animal products, what would be the change in environmental output? So this is a very nice summary done by Clark and Tillman in 2017 of different environmental impact metrics. So greenhouse gas emissions, land use, energy use, acidification, eutrophication potential. What we see here are our cereal grains, vegetables, eggs, dairy, poultry, pork, aquaculture products, and ruminant meat. And for almost every environmental metric, we see kind of an L shape to this graph, where as we move from cereal grains, vegetables, plant-based products, down into our ruminant meat, we see a dramatic increase in the environmental footprint of those products. But as I said, in substitution comparisons, i.e. just looking at the difference in carbon footprint, we make this implicit assumption that we're obtaining the same utility from a kilo of one product as we do from a kilo of another product. And certainly as a nutritionist, I would say that humans obtain dramatically different utility from meat than they do from cereal grains. So we need to, instead of thinking about kind of substituting one product for another, think instead about how humans utilize those products to create different diets, because that's really the way that people act on their food consumption patterns, is on a diet basis. All right, so this is a diet-based example. This is from the Eat Lancet report that I alluded to earlier, and this is a nice example of putting together several different food groups into a diet that meets the majority of human requirements, nutrient requirements. And this was also an attempt to limit the environmental impact of humans in the agricultural system. Now, one of the challenges with many of these diet-based assessments, and again, there's a wide variety of them. This is just the most recent one I'm aware of, so it's the one that I selected to talk about, is that they only ask the question, how do humans impact the environment? They don't necessarily ask the question, can the environment sustain that impact? I.e., can we actually produce this quantity of food? So just, a simple question here, again, using this diet as an example, if we scale this up to a global population of 10 billion people and kind of standardize that based on what we currently produce on a global scale, FAO data there, what proportion of our production would be used by this diet? Okay. And what you'll see is that in most cases, we would require fairly minimal increases in production of major food products, with the exception of legumes and nuts, right? So when you try and scale a diet like this to a population basis as opposed to an individual basis, it's important to ask that question of, can the agricultural system actually sustain that increase in productivity? Because again, when we ask these types of questions where we're making dramatic changes in the way that we consume products, we make the implicit assumption that humans are the only thing that controls agricultural land use, when in fact there are a lot of other factors that govern what can productively be produced on a piece of land. Things like climate, soil characteristics, and then socioeconomic factors as well. So considering those is also a really important part of these types of assessments. So in this kind of debate of whether livestock should be characterized as kind of nature's recycler, where they're producing high-quality human edible products from human inedible material, or whether they should be classified kind of as wasteful extravagance, where they're degrading natural resources and producing unhealthy products, we wanted to take the approach kind of asking, what can our food web support? And again, I'm showing the globe here, but certainly our assessment is really exclusively related to the US. So I'll move quickly here into our work on this topic, and this is the citation information for the paper. It's open source, if that's of interest. But what I do want to highlight here is that this is only one way of looking at the problem, right? There's a lot of different studies assessing, again, kind of changing human diets and what impact that might have on the agricultural system. We're sort of asking the flip side of that question. What can the agricultural system support in terms of human diets based on what we currently do in the United States? It is a US-centric assessment, which means that it's really only valid for United States agriculture. We have a fairly unique agricultural system, fairly unique socioeconomic drivers, and it's not really applicable to other agricultural systems throughout the globe. And then finally, I'd just highlight the fact that, rather than sort of being a be-all or end-all, as no study is, this is just a nice way to highlight some of the challenges with the way that we ask these types of questions. So I guess would just move through this section, taking those considerations into account. So what we were trying to accomplish primarily with this study was to characterize the role of animals in US agriculture by simulating this counterfactual scenario where we've removed all animals from the agricultural system. And we modeled total removal of livestock, not because it's likely or because we would support that, but simply because it requires the fewest number of assumptions. Dr. Godfrey alluded to this. Anytime we do these simulation studies, they're grounded in our assumptions. And I'll talk extensively about ours. But either way, modeling this kind of boundary to all possible intermediates required the fewest number of assumptions. It also sets the bounds for all other interventions. And that's not to say that this is a linear relationship, that between how much animal products we consume today and zero, there's a straight line. Absolutely not. Very likely there's probably an optima somewhere in the middle. But what we wanted to do was use this extreme scenario to inform kind of our language about animal products so that we can be highlighting the correct contribution. And I'll kind of address that as we go throughout. Finally, and perhaps from my perspective most importantly, we could model this with freely available data, which means that it didn't require outside funding. And for better or worse, when you have external funding for these types of assessments, there's questions about bias that come into them. So we're trying to avoid that from the get-go, fully acknowledging that as animal scientists, we would already have an issue with perceived bias in these types of assessments. There we go. So this is a listing of the different types of data that were used and brought together into this assessment. I'm happy to go through those in more detail if there's any questions about where things came from. But effectively what we've done is create an estimate of a population weighted average nutrient requirement. So this takes into account different age and gender groups and their nutrient requirements, as well as their prevalence in our population. And then we create an estimate using the domestic supply, 39 different nutrients from about 121 different foods that are produced in our country. From those two values, national requirement estimate, national supply estimate, we simply look at a food balance, right? How do our supplies match our requirements? And we do that in a system with animals and this hypothetical counterfactual scenario where we have eliminated animals from U.S. agriculture. So our system without animals, we make the assumption that croppable pasture, hay, and silage land are going to be converted to human food production, assuming the current ratio of land used. So that means if we produce apples on 5% of land in the U.S., they're going to be produced on 5% of the new land available from repurposing pasture, hay, and silage land. We assume that animals are going to consume products, humans are going to consume products that animals used to consume. That includes cereal grains and human edible byproducts like soybean meal. We assume that fertilizer previously produced by livestock would have to be synthesized as a replacement. And additionally, that food processing byproducts would need to be combusted so that they're not taking up space, either composting or landfilling. So if we hop into the results here, what we see is between our current agricultural system and this theoretical system where we've removed animals, there's actually about 23% more food available if we eliminate animals. The majority of that food comes in the form of cereal grains and legumes, again, because that's what we produce in this country. So if we stop feeding those materials to livestock, they're going to be available for people, assuming that we do not or cannot repurpose that land for other types of food products. The majority of that corn would be, the majority of that grain would be corn, and the vast majority of our legumes would be soy. If we compare these on an individual nutrient supply basis, we're looking at the billions of people's nutrient requirements that could be met for our different nutrients that we consider. The blue bars are our system with animals, the yellow bars are our system without animals, and for the vast majority of nutrients, which you can see, is that our yellow bars sort of far exceed our blue bars, suggesting that we can feed more people if we eliminated animals from the agricultural system for most nutrients. That was not the case for all nutrients. So we have reduced domestic supplies of calcium, vitamin A, vitamin D, B12, DHA, EPA, arachidonic acid, and alpha-linolenic acid. And I would just highlight that in many cases, these nutrients are ones that are in fairly low supply to begin with. So when we're looking for this to inform what's important about animal agriculture, it's providing some of these low supply micronutrients that appears to be a major role of animals in the agricultural system. We look at it on a greenhouse gas emissions basis. Animals currently supply about 50% of the greenhouse gas emissions in U.S. agriculture. But if we remove animals from the system, you see we only get about a 28% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And that's not necessarily because of our assumptions about fertilizer and byproduct output. What you'll highlight or see here down at the very bottom of this graph, a very small change is associated with synthesizing fertilizer and combusting those inedible byproducts. The vast majority of the change is that we currently feed a lot of material to livestock. If livestock are no longer there to sort of account those emissions too, they're no longer there, right? So those emissions need to be accounted directly to people instead. But I can make the same kind of criticism here as I did previously, that this isn't really reflective of the way that people would combine nutrients together into a diet. So we had this second objective, which was to try and characterize how diets might be put together from this land, or from our agricultural production. So instead of calculating just the nutrient balance, what we did was actually conduct an optimization. So we tried to minimize the cost a person would spend on their diet on a daily basis by adjusting feed intake, subject to the constraints that nutrient requirements needed to be satisfied, and that we needed to feed the U.S. population based on what we currently produce in this country. So I can kind of standardize this based on what our U.S. citizens currently eat. This is our diet breakdown by weight. The diet costs about $4 per person per day. It has a carbon footprint of 3.3 kilos of CO2 equivalent. If you include moisture, we consume about 1.5 kilos of feed per day. But in terms of dry material, that's actually just less than 0.5 kilo per day, which is really important to consider because our digestive physiology is adapted to a diet that has this type of kind of moisture to dry material ratio. If we look at least cost diet balance from these two agricultural systems, our breakdown of our current diet is fairly similar. Simply because of cost constraints, we're going to see more cereal grains included in that diet. Our system without animals, you see, is dramatically different, and that's largely because we're trying to use the products that are currently produced in the U.S. And so that means feeding animals quite a bit like feeding humans, quite a bit like the way that we currently feed animals. So if we compare the cost, it's a little bit more expensive in the system with animals. We have a little bit higher carbon footprint, but notably both of these are substantially lower than the current U.S. diet carbon footprint. Where we see some challenges, highlighting maybe the infeasibility of this type of diet, is really in the quantity of material that needs to be consumed per day. So 1.2 kilos of dry material would be consumed in this diet, which is probably outside the realm of feasibility for the average human. And again, what that highlights is just a mismatch between our agricultural system and what we would need to be consuming if we got rid of animal products. I would also highlight that this system without animals had additional nutrient deficiencies. So both diets were deficient in vitamin D, vitamin E, vitamin K, and choline because we don't produce enough of those nutrients in the U.S. to meet our population's requirements. But our system without animals was additionally deficient in calcium, vitamin A, B12, EPA, DHA, and arachidonic acid. So does that mean we can't balance vegetarian diets? Absolutely no. All it means is that we can't scale those vegetarian diets to a national level based on what our agricultural system currently does. And again, omega-3, omega-6 fatty acids, calcium, vitamin B12 being kind of our critical nutrients there. So in terms of a take-home message, changes in agricultural systems have collateral impacts. And when we do these types of assessments, we need to be considering those collateral impacts. There's going to be perhaps more total food, but there will also be additional nutrient deficiencies and an excess of calories because we're transitioning to a cereal grain-based diet. These diets have no resemblance to studied vegan diets, which highlights that if we want to move toward more plant-based diets, we need to change the way that we use land in the U.S. And finally, this type of dramatic change would really result in a fairly nominal national greenhouse gas emissions decline. I'll just take maybe 2 more minutes and talk really quickly about what I think are some important next steps in considering this type of discussion. This is just a model. All models are wrong. We hope that this is a useful one. There's a lot of things we didn't consider. So we didn't look at nutrient bioavailability. We didn't look at waste, non-food product alternatives, supplementation, the applicability of using life cycle assessments outside the system with which they were derived in. We didn't look at, again, that kind of non-linearity between what we currently consume and zero consumption. Didn't look at potential economic impacts here, non-greenhouse gas emissions, or considering alternatives in terms of cropping viability. But what I want to highlight, again, this last minute here, is the importance of looking at food waste. So I'll go back to this Lancet diet. If we adapt this diet just a little bit, so that we're reducing consumption of legumes and nuts within what we currently produce. And we're increasing our consumption of meat up to what we currently produce. You'll see that all of these values are either at 100% of current production or below. So said in a different way, we currently produce enough food to feed 10 billion people with select nutrient deficiencies, calcium, vitamin K, and choline. But we need to eliminate food waste. That means we need to consume all of the material that we currently produce on a global scale, which has major food distribution challenges and several other things kind of encompassed in it. But that's a very important message in terms of considering adaptations to our agricultural system. So is that a healthy diet though, right? It's a fairly large consumption of meat. This is I missed my citation here, it was a paper in Lancet Public Health just last year, looking at the proportion of energy in a diet coming from carbohydrates. So we see increased hazard ratio in terms of all causes of mortality when we go maybe below 40% of energy coming from carbohydrates, or above maybe 65% of energy coming from carbohydrates. This diet lies right in there, right? So about 57% of energy coming from carbohydrates, which would suggest that you're really no more likely to be to die because of this diet than you would be to die because of any other cause of mortality. So we would probably characterize it, at least based on this meta-analysis, as something that would be possibly a healthy diet. Now there's all sorts of definitions of healthy and we can debate that ad nauseum, but based on one metric, it appears to check out kind of okay. So I would highlight, as we move forward and perhaps to set up for the rest of the speakers, challenging ourselves on how to change our food distribution system so that we can eliminate food waste is a really important consideration. But additionally, we need to consider how we can continue these types of trends in terms of improving efficiency. Because again, we produce enough feed currently to meet that population target of 10 billion people. And if we can kind of freeze our agricultural production where it's at and continue to improve environmental impact, we have the opportunity to try and move back toward being within some of those planetary boundaries that we discussed at the beginning. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Robin. Interesting approach to think about eliminating animal foods from our diet. I know dietary changes occur slowly, but taking the extreme of what if we eliminate animals from our diet, what would be the impact? What an interesting approach. Do we have any questions? Yes, please.
I really enjoyed that talk, and I enjoyed your PNS paper of a few years back. I was wondering, have you looked at, instead of removing all livestock, that you remove the red and ruminant meat, and have you explored not just taking the land that's used and reallocating it to different food types, but doing carbon sequestration on it?
Yeah, so we have some work that's in revision right now. It's actually dairy focused as opposed to beef focused, but we look at different alternatives to how you could use that land. And certainly the way that you use it does impact the kind of net results in terms of carbon emissions. So if you're moving toward carbon sequestration, obviously that's tremendously better than most agricultural products. So that's kind of one side of the coin. The other side is if you move towards things like increasing production of fruits and vegetables, you actually see the flip side. You see an increase in emissions simply because those are such high yield products. So absolutely, and that highlights again just sort of the complexity and nonlinearity of some of these systems. With regard to removing ruminant products in particular, I would suggest that there's a very substantial need for dairy production in terms of providing high quality micronutrients. And one of the challenges with dairy production that we often forget is that it comes at the expense of beef production. So certainly in the US, we tend to keep those systems more segregated. In Europe, they're moving toward more integrated systems, which have reduced carbon emissions in terms of both products. And so I think that there's a nice example there of some opportunities we might have for adaptation.
Any other questions? Yes, please, Jack.
Yes. So a nice contrast between the two, at least on the surface. It is is the greenhouse charge against animal agriculture in your prognosis? And you've got a different perspective on really what happens if they're removed and what the real impact of that might be. Actually a lot less, and it's a matter of where you charge that carbon, because it's the recycling dimension of it. If they're using materials in a recycling way, that's not the same burden, I guess. And your modeling illustrates that basically shifts.
Yeah, and I think to Dr. Godfrey's point, the place where we see all of that 50% of emissions kind of credited back would be if we took the land out of production entirely. So if we don't need it for food, that's one thing. But I think the waste estimates at the very end there would kind of highlight the fact that we sort of do need all of our agricultural land for food, at least on a global scale. Certainly on the US, we overproduce, but we also have a very strong export economy. So there's some economic dimension to that challenge as well. But I think finding a balance there between producing what we need in an efficient manner and not overproducing is probably almost as important as the dietary challenge of finding the right kind of moderation in our consumption.
One of the things that I don't quite understand with model these is, so right now, if you have like the Midwest where there's a lot of corn and soybeans grown, and it's grown at very large, bushels per acre capacities. If you shift away from animal products, then if you shift away from those types of meats and go to more pulses, vegetables, is the land capacity there to do that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's sort of why we stuck with the assumption that we did. There's a great paper that I'm not going to remember the citation of, but I could find it for you, that was put out last year. I think it was +1, that's a GIS-based assessment of the U.S. and looking at agricultural productivity options. And what they find is, I think in terms of fruits and vegetables in particular, we could expand that land on the order of 1 to 2 percentage units, not something like 30 percentage units, which would encompass kind of transitioning the Midwest into fruit and vegetable production. So I think doing more of those types of in-depth assessments is what's needed to really address your question more completely.
Very good. Let's give Robin another round of applause for a wonderful presentation. Thank you, Robin.